Let's go to Steve Quayle now. Steve was one of the original founders of the PrEP movement. He's been a talk radio host for 20 years. He was a lone voice 20 years ago saying that the Chinese and Russians would ultimately back their currencies with gold, that they would want to cash these in on something besides the petrodollar. He's the author of 10 books. His most recent, entitled Xenogenesis, Turning Men into Monsters. He wrote Breathe No Evil 15 years ago on understanding bioweapons before anyone thought it was a problem. I wonder what he thinks about what's going on in Tulane with this Burkholderia pseudomallei that got out of the lab, and they still don't know how it got out. Maybe we'll talk to him about that, but primarily I wanted to talk to him about Jade Helm. Joining us now is Steve Quayle. Thank you, Steve.
Wow, David, good. It's really nice to be on with you because Jade Helm, I think, needs to be put in the larger context. This is the first time in history that a 2-month-long operation is going to be focusing on the American public. We know that the same tactics that are being proposed for the exercise to take place between the hours of midnight and 4 or 5 in the morning is exactly what the special operations troops did prior to the bombing of Iraq and all of our different Middle Eastern ventures, whether it's Afghanistan. In other words, you move the special operations community in prior to an event. Now, remember, I want to take everybody back to Larry Greatwall in his book, No Place to Hide. If people remember, he was the one that penetrated the weather underground when Bill Ayers and 24 other elite from Ivy League trained schools were talking about the necessity in the early 70s of killing 25 million Americans, and prior to the killing of them, moving them into detention camps for re-education. Now, I know, David, that you've read his stuff, but here's the larger context. I think that people are being tied up with the events or the implementation of how they're going to round up people and kill them, and they're forgetting the idea that when Bill Ayers was making this comment, he was deadly serious. Now, I've just taken the population density at that point in history, moved it into our point in history, and the numbers I've heard from special operations, active duty generals in the past, contemporary military and intelligence agents, is they're up to 80 million to 100 million people. So I think if people put it into context, notice the change. Notice the change when Middle East terrorists became obviously embraced by this administration. Now, that's the context. I think that people have got to understand that context, David, because what we're talking about is not an exercise. When the local police are told to stand down and not respond to gunfire, by the way, it's a live fire exercise. When we've seen massive YouTube videos, you guys at Infowars.com have led the charge in showing all the videos coming into you from all over the country. People are now starting to get it. And the point that I want to really get across to everyone today, and thank you for taking this hour out of your time to interview me, is this. This is the full-scale implementation of the red, the blue, and the green list. The red list are people. Now, do you remember, David, and I'll let you obviously respond because that's just my intro, the days years ago when gun owners' homes are being GPSed?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we warned about that. And we tried to get people to understand. I was literally in my front yard in right at a mountain community at the base of the mountains in Bozeman, Montana, when the guy came up with his GPS unit and his bicycle and came literally to my front door. And I watched. The reason I didn't challenge him at the time, I wanted to see. To the left of me were leftists, to the right of me were leftists, and I wanted to see if they even got GPS. Absolutely not, okay? So I watched. This is not a report. Well, we heard massive reports of that happening. And the deal that people have got to understand is this, that with the implementation of the red list, the blue list, and green list, that was given to me almost 20 years ago, actually before that, about how it would be implemented when they were ready to make their move by the former head of the Environmental Protection Agency, who was murdered for the Western United States. So that wasn't just, quote, internet talk, and obviously that at that point the internet was just in its beginnings. But I think it's important that people have got to understand that this explains everything. It explains the Chinese, it explains the Russians, it explains the North Koreans, and it explains the assault coming on the United States from Mexico. Remember when we broke the story? I think Alex had me on to talk about the Chinese troops. You guys verified it below the border.
Yes. Yes.
And then the thing that people have got to understand is that this is the plan. So when I say don't lose track of it in perspective, I want to just make one sentence and I'll give it back to you. In No Place to Hide, I call him Great Wall, maybe it's Grathwall, explains that the weathermen actually believed that they would be successful in overthrowing U.S. government, and that with the help of the Cubans, Chinese, Russians, and North Vietnamese, they would occupy America. Now remember, this is during the Vietnam War. Americans would have to be re-educated in camps, similar to what communists did in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and other countries that they had taken over. And then here's one of the most chilling revelations. I asked, well, Great Wall speaking, well, what is going to happen to those people we can't re-educate that are diehard capitalists? And the reply is they'd have to be eliminated. So, David, that's the context of what we see. The American people, as Alex has pointed out, as you've pointed out, as going on day after day, hours after hours, have become the enemy. And now, in the face of basically nuclear tension, and for the record, I used to write about nuclear weapons and their effects, and during the Cold War years, and civil defense and all that stuff. So as I look back on the perspective, we have seen the absolute taking apart of our military. Our top flag officers and generals fired, any battlefield experience, and we've seen complete redirection of funds from foreign enemies to the internal enemies. And I've read on the air the letter that was sent in those days by, I believe it was either Janet Reno or Napolitano to the Russians requesting their help and the foreign troops. So you can't deny it any longer. People used to poo-poo black helicopters. They used to poo-poo Russian troops, Chinese troops.
Well, of course, I think exactly. We've had the article we put up over the weekend that Paul Joseph Watson and Alex Jones put together, listing all the many times that they have defined who their domestic enemies are. It's not just what Larry Grathwohl was saying. We've been seeing this coming from the administration. We've been seeing it coming out of the military academies and other think tanks that are associated with the military. We saw it coming out of the MIAC report. When they define what their enemy is, when they come in and do things like the NDAA, and then they start having these training exercises like we saw in Fort Lauderdale, where it looks like they're actually implementing the NDAA, dragging people who are civilians down the street, taking them off in helicopters, marching them in single file with military guards on either side, putting them into white vans and driving them off. I mean, that's exactly what we would expect to see if they implement the NDAA. But, of course, they told us, don't worry, we're not actually going to do that. I don't believe that they're not actually going to do it. I don't know when they're going to do it. But, of course, as many people have pointed out, whenever there's been a massive false flag attack or whatever, they've had a drill that's going on exactly at the same time in the same way. We saw this with the 7/7 bombings in London and the subway bombings. These people came back the day or so after and said, well, isn't this amazing? We were running a drill in exactly the same place with exactly the same scenario at the same time this was happening. It happened with 9/11. They can always use that to keep the people who are compartmentalized to not understand what's going on. And then the mass public looks at this and says, well, yeah, this came out after the fact. But when we expose it before the fact, maybe this particular time, this won't happen. Maybe they will just do some kind of a training exercise. But we always need to be on the alert. Stay with us. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll come right back to you. Steve Quayle, we're talking about Operation Jade Helm, and Steve is going to tie this together for us on what he thinks is the broader picture. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show on this April Fool's Day, this April 1st, 2015. And we have a special at the InfoWars store, our No Fooling special. Actually, for real, you get free shipping all the way through this Friday. Everything at the store. And I'll remind you that as we're looking at this article here, human birth control chemical BPA is causing lower fertility in fish, say government scientists. This is reported by the Washington Post. It's producing offspring that struggle to fertilize eggs because of the plastics that they're finding in the water. But, of course, you're also going to find SSRIs. Even if you're not on a municipal water supply, you're going to, especially out in the country, a lot of people are using, farms are using glyphosate very heavily, Roundup. You can filter that out with a ProPure filter. You can find that at the InfoWars store, 10% off. And, again, it's free shipping between now and Friday at the InfoWars stores, InfoWars store and InfoWarsLife.com. I want to go back to Steve Quayle. And Steve, you were talking about the fact that you're concerned that this is coming to the next step, coming to fruition in terms of a war against the American people, talking about Larry Grathwohl. You're talking about the red list, the blue list, and the green list. Break that down for the audience.
The red list are the primary target for the New World Order in the United States of America when the order is given. The lists already exist, and again, according to, and I want to make this clear, I cannot know this stuff unless people tell me. Just like Alex gets tips, you get tips, David. There are people out there that genuinely love their country. So that's how I got this. The red list are primarily firearms owners. They are constitutionalists. They are people who have been politically active in resisting the New World Order. And those are the people that are their targets. And let me make this clear. They're not coming to take the guns away. They're coming to terminate, exterminate, blow away the gun owners. Again, special operations teams are not sent in to take prisoners unless it's a high-value target for a later date. They basically are trained to go in and just obliterate, okay? Now, again, when I get told this by a four-star general, active duty, and by the way, you guys have more probably active duty spec ops and spooks in Austin than any other city in the United States of America. You probably know that. If you don't, I will tell you that. And the thing that's fascinating to me, David, is the red list basically goes down the first 30 days, okay? So let's say they've increased it to 60 days. Well, they're combining now two different events. Now, the system that's been set to communicate with law enforcement from the Department of Homeland Security is a pretty secure system now. They can lock out individual officers from being able to hear the general alerts. They can punish or they can terminate. Now, these are really hard statements for people to understand. Quick anecdote, 30-second version. Chief of detectives in a major metropolitan city heard me on, I think it was one of the interviews Alex and I were doing a couple years ago. He didn't think I was basically upfront with the information until a foreign observer was assigned. I told him what to look for. The foreign observer knew everything about his family, his children, when they went to school, how much money he made. He knew everything, and he rode along in the back of two detectives' cars. And the interesting thing is I got a call from the individual probably a week later, and he said, "You're right. This is going down just exactly as you said." Well, I wasn't the originator of that. The blue list are law enforcement, National Guard, and anybody who's contributing to the execution and the takedown of the red list. 30 days to 60 days after that, those guys get wasted. Now, I don't know what word you would use, David, but they're murdered. They're killed.
Yeah.
Now, where have we seen that in history before? Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, the Navy SEALs that got bin Laden, right?
Yep, you got it.
Yeah.
And so, as a matter of fact, before we went on this show, I was contacted by a Navy SEAL overseas, and he said, "Steve, I cannot believe what's happening to the country I love and was ready to lay down my life for." He said, "It's like a pall, if you will, a blanket of darkness has settled over the country and people can't see." What's happened, David, is one of the things that I've really tried to do in talk radio and all the stuff I've written and the interviews I've done, 9,000 plus hours, is to get people to understand. You've got to understand the root of evil because everything else is an offshoot of evil. May I speak? I'll give you one more interview that took place recently with a personal friend of mine, known to me, who met with various generals, retired, and what they told him was simply this, is that it is going operational. Now, this is generals. This isn't make-believe. This isn't scuttlebutt. This isn't internet rumor, okay? And the gentleman just happened to be at the top of their hit list.
We got to go to break, Steve. Hang on, we're going to come right back. And, quite frankly, it's kind of like the couple that drove the car off the GPS bridge. How many signs do we need before we start to pay attention? If it isn't happening now, it's going to be happening very soon. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Steve Quayle talking about Jade Helm. We're talking to Steve Quayle, stevequayle.com. We're breaking down, Steve was breaking down for us the red list, the blue list. We haven't gotten to the green list yet, but Steve, just before we had to go to the break, you started talking about a source that you had and who thought this was going to be operational. Tell us what he said. Start that over again for people who are just tuning in.
Former Green Beret had a meeting with retired generals and high-ranking former enlisted men who were very concerned because the friend of mine that had the meeting was asked to come to the meeting because supposedly there was a Pentagon memorandum put out about some of the people in this country that they are forbidden to listen to. He happened to be one of them. Alex happened to be one of them. I happened to be one of them. Hawk happened to be one of them, and Doug Hagman happened to be one. There were two other guys that he couldn't remember their name, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, and I don't know it or I tell it. Here's the issue. The issue is, David, that the American people must understand that the sheer placement of the tanks, the armored personnel carriers, troops on the streets, and everything else is indicative. Now, let's talk about Jade Helm, the name. May I do that? The Blues simply are the people that they go into re-education and are assimilated. They get to live, but they get to live as perpetual drones or techno-serfs at the behest of the New World Order. The thing that is really critical for people to understand is that Jade Helm's name, Jade is always associated with China. It has nothing to do primarily with the Middle East. It has everything to do with the Far East. If I tell you the captain's at the helm, that means he's steering the ship. That means that he is the one who's in charge of the direction. One of the Chinese demands upon the United States government was the fact that they needed to disarm the American public. You remember that story when it came out that China absolutely demanded that the American public be disarmed?
Yeah, I remember that was kind of strange, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And there's always something behind that. It's kind of like when the UN came out and said, you need to shut down Colorado and Washington State. The federal government needs to shut that down because we have a UN drug treaty. And, of course, it was the UN that set up the schedule for the war on drugs 10 years before Nixon declared the war on drugs.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what's important is everything's in a name. Now, look, it's not lost in the financial markets that China has amassed the world's largest gold hoard, and this has everything to do with the name Jade Helm 15. Obviously, 15 can relate to the year that it's going to be implemented, as in this year. China is going to make an announcement at some point, and we're seeing it with the AIIB Bank. We're seeing it with the nations abandoning former allies. It doesn't matter if it's Australia, doesn't matter if it's Britain, it doesn't matter who it is. Everyone's going to China because basically it's a truism, a maxism in the world that he who has the gold makes the rules. One of the things the bankers have been able to do is to transfer the gold that was in the United States. It's irrelevant if there's anything in Fort Knox. I'm here to tell you that there's nothing there. The point being is that China, with its 30,000 plus tons of gold, by the way, the World Gold Council is totally inaccurate in the country's gold holdings, just they're wrong. Russia, for instance, has right now in excess of 10 to 15,000 tons of gold. So the point is, let me make this clear. Jade Helm may be the orchestration and the introduction of the Chinese yuan or renminbi in a gold-backed or commodity-backed form. At that point, the dollar will lose value almost overnight, if not become worthless. My guess is, just quick and dirty, it goes down 50% in a matter of days and then another 30%. Well, that's not going to make anybody happy in the United States. The point being is that the riots will be generated. Now, here's something people need to do. Go to the root of the problem. You'll understand the fruit and how it will be implemented. In order for the communist revolution to take place, they want to engender civil war. I've been saying that. Alex has been saying that. And by the way, obviously with the Mayak report and others, when the veterans were vilified, any man or woman who has served in this country in any official capacity had to note that this man's military, and I've never been in the military, but that's what a lot of them call it, has changed so dramatically. And it's fascinating to me that even yesterday or the day before, I may be off a day, but the President of the United States has now declared they want to cut back the military pensions. At the same time, there's unlimited amounts of money to purchase billions of rounds of ammo, MRAPs, the police department who have been militarized. So here's what I'm saying.
When you're talking about that, Steve, I think it's very interesting that it was just last summer that the Pentagon announced that they were going to stop giving equipment to fire departments. This was something that they've been doing since the right after World War II, giving equipment to small rural fire departments because they can't afford very much, and they're the ones who have to deal with the really large fires. And so they shut that down. It stayed shut down for about a month, but there was a lot of pressure from the firemen, from congressmen and senators. They got that restarted. But that was happening at the very same time they couldn't get enough equipment quickly enough into all these small towns for law enforcement. They only wanted to give equipment to people who had the power and the authority to arrest. That was going to be what they were going to do it for, not to the fire departments. They wanted to completely shut that down.
Well, and you're correct. So the point is that, in essence, all the fire departments, any authority figures that with the power to arrest, and by the way, everybody, as you know, has been given the power to arrest now, from IRS agents to, remember when the Forest Service Rangers never wore weapons? I can tell you from watching them, I take a lot of photographs, and, you know, in the national parks, and now you would swear that you would declare freely. You can't believe how weighted down those guys are with weapons in their car, AR-15s and shotguns.
And of course, you shouldn't worry about the fact that they got billions of rounds of hollow point bullets, which the military doesn't even use. You shouldn't even worry about that. As we got all the pushback, they would look at the small purchases for some of these organizations, say, well, that's just for target shooting. But it's $3 billion. They would take the very smallest ones and they would push back against that. But we won that fight. And I guess, Steve, the question is, we also had this fight about a year ago with them trying to start the war in Syria with a false flag sarin gas attack, trying to blame that on the appropriate parties so they could use that as a pretext for war. Do you think that because this has been exposed, has gone viral, and there's so much talk about it, do you think that they will just stand this down and it'll just be a training exercise? Not to say that they won't do this in the future, but don't you think that that the very publicity that has come there might make them to stand down on this for the time being?
Yeah, that's what I'm praying for, literally, okay? And I literally am asking the prayerful, believing Christians around the world to pray against this because, again, it's kind of like when in even the Old Testament times, David, when, you know, the idea or the plan to murder all of God's people that, you know, was taking place, God raised up somebody, whether it was the prophet Elijah, who could read the king's thoughts while he slept on his bed. I think that when at least a covert operation gets exposed, that they have to rethink. And let me share this. These guys have supercomputers calculating every single step and every single response. They have algorithms. When I broke the story about algorithms, the mathematical, if you will, structuring of specific, if you will, assassination parameters and rating people on a different scale, they have their targets already gridded out. It is my prayer, it is my concern that enough people scream about this, that enough people go to the congressman, because I posted a couple of weeks ago, do you remember the old miniseries America?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
You remember that the scene where the Russians come in under the guise of being, quote, national terrorists and kill all of Congress?
Yeah.
And the Russian is addressing? Well, isn't it interesting that, what was it, the senator from South Carolina made the statement that, you know, Obama should have the right to basically do away with Congress. You remember that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, effectively, he has, hasn't he? I mean, he pretty much does whatever he wishes. He's not constrained by the Constitution, by laws. He's not constrained by Congress or their threats. I mean, they're saying now, you know, he wants to do he wants to implement the UN's climate change treaty just by executive order. And the Republicans are saying, well, you know, all these countries need to realize that we just may undo that. They know they're not going to undo anything. These guys are not doing anything.
Something? You know, this is something critical. And please understand, the root is what I'm talking about. If people will go on my website and go to my alert section, I just posted this as Nico was giving me the countdown for the break. And I didn't know this. I'm not a video gamer, but are you familiar with Diablo 3?
No.
Diablo 3, the main character, the witch doctor, is Jade Helm, okay? And I want to read this because, again, This has this. Even Alex is talking more and more. When I say even Alex, as Alex is talking more and more about the demonic manifestation, the supernatural element, people have got to read this. It's on my website, stevequayle.com. Go over on the right, It's the Q alert, big Q, and it says alerts. I was blown away by this. Some lady named Jean sent it to me, and I want to read this to you because it's just a quick paragraph, you know. It says the witch doctor. That's the witch doctor is a character that uses the Jade Helm, again from their website. He weaves the power of the spirits of the unformed land, summoning creatures from beyond the grave. He summons frightful, undead vermin and other creatures for protection and offense, uses destructive poisons, acids, fire attacks, power spells, and summons with mana a slow, accruing but deep well of energy. The witch doctors make use of a variety of weaponry. I think that the critical thing that people have to understand, you brought up Syria. Here it is in context. If people can understand this simple concept, everything, makes sense. Number one, in order for the Mahdi to come on the scene, that is obviously the Islamic savior. That is obviously the reign and rule of Muhammad on earth. There has to be a global nuclear conflagration. Are you aware of that?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and please, I only ask that basically to allow you to feed back because I don't want to dominate, but I think we only got an hour. The thing is that we are now seeing the disruption of all the countries in the Middle East. Well, classical Christian dispensationalism always said the 10 nations were the Holy Roman Empire. I said, decades ago, this is only to put it into perspective, that I saw a 10-nation federation building and coming into being in the Middle East. Now you've got the whole Middle East on fire. You've got basically the ultimate betrayal of Israel by the United States. Now, whether people like Israel, don't like them, the point being is in the Old Testament prophecies of Zechariah, it says all the nations of the world will gather against Jerusalem. That's happening.
I think you're very right. What we need to hope for is that by exposing this, we are going to shut it down at least this time. Perhaps they'll decide that maybe they'll just do this exercise on an annual basis, and maybe by Jade Helm 17, they'll actually roll it out. But I think you're right when you said earlier we need to pray about this. We need to ask that this would not happen, that we would have peace, not only in our country, but in these other countries. And I should have mentioned it earlier, too. Alex is having a hernia operation today. I'd ask people to pray for Alex, pray that he would have a successful outcome, there wouldn't be any complications, that he would be at peace with this and have a quick recovery. So I'd ask for people's prayers about that. And he gave me this before he left. He said that he's going to be running I just want to mention this quickly, a free shipping special. It's our April Fool's special, but there's no fooling. We do have free shipping through Wednesday, and this is the last chance. This is the last day to get DNA Force. He had that expiring at the end of March, but he's run it for one more day. You can get that for 30% off. It's about $40 off of those ingredients. Of course, you need to have clear minds and healthy bodies to fight tyranny, and we have Nobel Prize-winning studies that confirm that the ingredients in this DNA Force will help your body. Its mitochondrial health will help it to fight the toxins that you're constantly exposed to. So again, that's 30% off the very last day, DNA Force, and you can get free shipping on everything at the store, no fooling. Now, Steve, as you were pointing out, I think it's very interesting to look at this enemies list that they have, and the fact that the connection that the Chinese government is starting this Asian investment bank, and that is really taking off. I mean, that's turning into an avalanche of people who are signing up for that. And of course, the Chinese are flush with cash. They're using this in a very different way than we have used the IMF fund. But even the United States is trying to get on this just so that they won't be left off. We see a massive shift from the United States, of course, to China. But that's been going on for quite some time. Everybody can see that. But it's really accelerating at this point, isn't it?
Well, it's not only accelerating, but, somebody said, what's in a name? My answer to that is everything. When any operation is chosen, there is usually a reason for the name being chosen. And that's why I believe that Jade Helm is so critical. Let me make this clear. And this is something that, I stand on after 10 or 12 books. I think I'm up to 12 now. Thanks for announcing that. But the point that I'm trying to provide for people is a perspective, how to embrace this. Because if you try, and David, you'll find this out, if you try and look at this purely in the natural, there is you cannot look at it purely in the natural, because it's like and I'm going to use the word, supernatural evil force that's seeking to subject and subjugate the people of the world, not only kill them. Look, the Illuminati, Alex is...
Yeah, and it's multi-generational as well. I mean, that's something that we see, this relentless progression towards this. And it's like, why would the people care so much to pass on an agenda from one generation to the other? You would think each generation would have its own agenda. But as you point out, this is a supernatural backing behind this. That's, I think, why this continues along this same path of progression from generation to generation.
Well, and again, that's why I'm accelerating my efforts. Look, I don't know how long I have. By the grace of God, I thank everyone for their prayers, and I do pray for Alex. Thank God a hernia. I had an operation years ago, hernia operation, and when they do them right, you're on your feet pretty quick. You hurt a little bit, but may my prayers go with him, and I thank God for everyone who prays for Alex's safety, the protection around his family. But I want to share something, David. This is important, because unless, and I want to say this, if this were my last time on talk radio, I would say what I'm going to say right now. Unless people understand the supernatural root of evil, they will not understand that when the Illuminati talks in the Georgia Guidestones about 500 million people being left, Alex and I did a show where we quoted every, person of power and how they hate humanity. The vaccines, it was on Infowars.com when we were going to have this level 5 biological shutdown of the country. Alex let me pray at that point, and I said, the only thing I got from the Lord was, watch what I will do. Within 24 hours, we were going from a global pandemic, shutdown, and martial law to the thing fading out and fizzling out. When we started exposing Ebola, the thing faded out and fizzled out. Not to say it won't come back. The point being is, when you hear of almost ridiculous releases of some of the most deadly pathogens in the world, and I wrote Breathe No Evil 15 years ago, the point is that I know how these people think, because, again, there is a God in heaven who reveals the secrets to his servants, the prophets. I'm not a prophet. All I am is a watchman. Now, I want to
Absolutely. Hang on, Steve. We've got to go to a commercial break. When we come back, I do want to talk to you about that book, Breathe No Evil, in light of what just happened in Tulane University. Stay with us. We'll be right back. We're talking to Steve Quayle. We've been talking about Jade Helm, and Steve's pulled us back to talk about the broader context. And, Steve, I want to talk about your book here, Xenogenesis, Turning Men into Monsters. You'd also talked about, you also had a book, Breathe No Evil, where you were talking about bioweapons. And we've just gotten a glimpse into the massive, if you want to call it, incompetence of the CDC and these biotech companies who are bringing foreign pathogens, very deadly pathogens, into this country. We just saw an example of it in Tulane, to give them a gain of function. That's what they call it. Enhancing them to withstand medication, to also spread more easily. And so we have to look at this and say, what is the madness behind this? Why would they even get themselves involved in something like this? But break down your other book, Xenogenesis, Turning Men into Monsters.
Well, xenogenesis is important for people to understand, because behind the intentional release of bioweapons, remember this, that when people are being exposed to headlines that there's been a strange release, or that the CDC, that Center for Disease Control, thought that the last remaining supplies of smallpox always mysteriously turn up, every pathogen worldwide that has been located, isolated, or reanimated is designed for bioweapons. The basis of all bioweapons is ultimately first to kill the enemy, but ultimately to end all life. When I broke the story, David, 30-second important story on race-specific bioweapons in South Africa, designed by Dr. Wouter Besson, that went wild throughout the world. There was absolutely a project called Project Coast, but to give it a more impetus, when Alex and I, or whoever, talks about singularity, that talks about transhumanism, that talks about all of the different technological enhancements to mankind, super soldiers, this is stuff that I wrote in my book, Xenogenesis. What they're doing is taking third-party DNA sequences, hence xenogenesis just means the addition of additional helix to the double helix, creating a triple helix, in other words, a stand, and creating literally new life forms. Now, when I first wrote that in Genetic Armageddon 15 years ago, people just couldn't handle it. But now we're right there where, guess what? The lie that people are being told is biological enhancements are one thing, but when you combine them with robotics, you're going to get basically an Uberman, which Nietzsche talked about, and which the Nazis were absolutely looking for. The word Ubermensch literally means supermen. So when DARPA went forward with its super soldier program and basically started integrating specific gene traits from animals, i.e. eagle vision, i.e. regenerative processes of a salamander, i.e. all of the different things. You know, it's just like this was a comic book series coming out into real time. And again, because I've been so far ahead, it's just like this, ladies and gentlemen. The bottom line, I used to say that all the time, David, and people would send me email, don't use that, you're overusing. No, the bottom line means when you cut through all the crap, when you cut through all the haze, all the fog, and all of the misdirection, the bottom line is there is a supernatural force called the devil, which the Luciferians worship, that are trying to kill off every man, woman, and child. And what they're promising is eternal life, and they're promising supernatural and the ability to basically live forever and have to deal with nothing, with super intelligence. It's kind of like Animal Farm on steroids.
Absolutely.
Everybody is equal.
Well, actually, Steve, it's kind of like Genesis, the serpent promised that with this knowledge, you're going to be able to live forever. You know, you're not going to ever die. Thank you so much for joining us at stevequayle.com.